I knew something was wrong when the espresso machine on the executive floor choked on coffee grounds like it was choking on corporate secrets. The entire 12th floor of Apex Cloud Systems buzzed with an unnatural quiet. People offered tight smiles and stiff nods, while a mid-level manager from accounting whistled nervously as if trying to drown out an impending disaster. I ignored the peculiar atmosphere. I had spent 18 months dragging our flagship enterprise cloud architecture from raw whiteboard sketches to a multi-agency federal contract engine. Today was launch day. $240 million in projected enterprise valuation hung in the balance. 6 major technology partners were on standby. 4 federal regulatory bodies had signaled preliminary compliance clearance, and every executive who cared about quarterly survival was expected in the main boardroom. My assistant, Colin Vance, met me near the glass conference doors at 8:55 in the morning. He carried a fresh cup of dark roast in one hand and held his tablet with a pale, trembling grip. Colin was 53 years old, a seasoned administrative veteran who usually handled launch mornings with calm focus. Today, he looked like a man who had accidentally walked onto a crime scene. "Are you presenting from the encrypted release drive, Nolan?" Colin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I tapped the silver flash drive in my breast pocket. "Everything has been audited and locked in the secure repository, Colin. Architecture overlays, federal encryption keys, partner disclosures, and compliance sign-offs." "Why do you ask?" Colin hesitated, swallowing hard. Julian Thorne called an emergency briefing earlier. "And Nolan, why did you insist on keeping Clause 8.2 in your executive employment agreement?" Most vice presidents strip out those indemnification triggers during negotiations. I offered a thin smile. "Clause 8.2 is like a parachute. You hope you never have to pull the ripcord, but you never step onto the aircraft without verifying the harness." I stepped toward the main boardroom. Every step felt measured and deliberate. I reached the frosted double doors of Boardroom A, expecting the familiar hum of dual projectors, the click of laptop keys, and senior officers reviewing partner decks. Instead, I pushed the doors open to absolute darkness and cold air. The leather chairs were empty. The wall-mounted digital displays were dark. The long mahogany conference table sat vacant under dim emergency lights. A light, mocking chuckle sounded behind me. Standing near the hallway pillar was Julian Thorne, our chief product officer. He wore a tailored suit, held a coffee cup, and sported a triumphant smirk. "Looking for the launch party, Nolan?" Julian asked with smug satisfaction. "Didn't Colin tell you? We bumped the global enterprise launch to yesterday afternoon, went live at 4 o'clock sharp. Tremendous feedback from the board. You were missed, of course." Julian reached into his pocket and tossed a small black flash drive toward me. I caught it on instinct. "That is the pitch deck we presented to external partners and federal liaisons," Julian added, adjusting his cuffs. "Saved you the trouble of prepping your slides." "Don't worry, we trimmed out your dense technical jargon to make it digestible for executive leadership." He walked away down the corridor, his shoes clicking loudly against the marble floor. Radiating unearned confidence, I stepped inside the dark boardroom, closed the door, and inserted the flash drive into my laptop. The drive auto-loaded a file titled Apex Cloud Enterprise Launch Deck Final Approved. As I scrolled through the slides, a cold, surgical clarity settled in my chest. Julian had taken my 18 months of proprietary cloud architecture and mangled it into a superficial marketing brochure. Gone were the mandatory federal compliance notations required under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code. Gone were the encryption keys verifying system integrity. Gone were the partner-specific intellectual property disclaimers that protected our enterprise clients. Most egregiously, Julian had stripped out my author sign-off and released timestamp from the chain of custody, attempting to present my proprietary architecture as his own product creation while bypassing all internal governance. Julian believed that by launching 24 hours early in my absence, he could seize personal credit for a $240 million enterprise platform while discarding the legal safeguards I had built into the system. He assumed my silence in that empty boardroom meant defeat. He was wrong. Julian did not know that Clause 8.2 of my executive contract was a legally binding deadman switch. negotiated when Apex Cloud Systems recruited me. Clause 8.2 explicitly dictated that no external technical document, proprietary code release, or partner-facing architectural deck could be distributed without three mandatory elements: my verified cryptographic signatory approval, an immutable compliance timestamp, and complete intellectual property attribution. Under federal contract law, any release lacking these three components was declared null and void ab initio from inception, subjecting the unauthorized distributor to immediate compliance recall, breach of fiduciary duty liability, and federal debarment. I closed my laptop, walked back to my corner office, and locked the door. I pulled out my notarized executive agreement from my safe, verified the language of Clause 8.2, and opened my email client. I drafted a concise, two-line message to Chief Legal Counsel Conrad and Compliance Officer Clara Miller. I attached the complete metadata delta report, comparing my authorized release build against Julian's fraudulent deck, along with the cryptographic audit trail subject. Clause 8.2 Enforcement Request Unauthorized IP Release. Baby. Please find attached the formal compliance metadata audit and contractual enforcement demand under Clause 8.2 of my executive agreement. The external product launch executed on October 2nd lacks mandatory author sign-off, violates federal IP compliance protocols, and is hereby declared void ab initio. Immediate compliance recall requested. I hit send. Then I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of water, and watched the corporate gears begin to turn. The silence that followed my email was quiet, cold, and absolute. At 7:29 the following morning, the executive conference room on the 12th floor was dimly lit. The blinds were drawn tight, casting long blue shadows across the polished conference table. Present in the room were Chief Legal Counsel Conrad, Compliance Officer Clara Miller, Vice President of Risk Vance Miller, and Director of Enterprise Partnerships Grant Miller. I sat at the far end of the table with a hot cup of black coffee, watching the heavy oak door. Julian Thorne had been formally summoned to the emergency compliance hearing at 7 o'clock sharp. His seat at the table remained empty. He had not sent an apology, nor had he offered an explanation, operating under the foolish assumption that internal legal notices were mere bureaucratic formalities that could be safely ignored by an executive of his stature. At 7:35, Counsel Conrad opened a thick black binder and cleared his throat. As of 6:42 this morning, our internal audit team confirmed that the product launch deck distributed to external partners and federal agencies did not originate from the authorized secure repository. It completely bypassed cryptographic validation and timestamping protocols. Clara Miller pulled up the metadata logs on the wall projector. Per Clause 8.2 of Nolan Vance's executive agreement, any external distribution of proprietary cloud architecture without verified author sign-off constitutes an unauthorized release of protected intellectual property under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 106. Furthermore, because the deck omitted mandatory compliance disclosures, the release violates federal procurement standards and triggers immediate breach of fiduciary duty concerns for executive leadership. Vance Miller rubbed his temples, his face pale with exhaustion and visible anxiety. What is our actual corporate exposure if partners review these files? Counsel Conrad looked around the room with grave solemnity. Under federal contract doctrine, because the release lacks authorized signatory clearance, every external partner agreement signed yesterday is legally void ab initio. We are obligated under Federal Warrant Act and compliance audit guidelines to notify all 6 enterprise partners and 4 federal regulatory liaisons immediately that the distributed material contains unverified assertions and unauthorized intellectual property. I did not say a word throughout the entire discussion. I did not need to speak. The evidence sat on the high-definition projector screen in precise, undeniable rows of time-stamped metadata. By 10:15 that morning, the formal legal notifications were dispatched across secure channels. The fallout was swift, brutal, and devastating. The first response arrived from a lead federal defense liaison. The email was brief and unyielding. Please be advised that in light of compliance discrepancies regarding signatory authorization on the October 2nd launch deck, All federal contract disbursements, totaling $140 million, are placed on immediate administrative hold, pending full audit resolution. 20 minutes later, a major healthcare technology partner sent a formal notice. Due to potential breach of proprietary architecture disclosures and lack of verified legal sign-off, our organization has suspended all integration scheduling. If legal clarity and authorized sign-offs are not provided within 72 hours, we will execute formal contract termination and initiate asset protection protocols under dissipation of corporate assets doctrines. By noon, all 6 enterprise partners had halted rollout operations completely. $240 million in enterprise value, federal contract disbursements, and long-term integration agreements froze in place like water turning to ice. Inside the executive suites, panic spread like wildfire through dry timber. Department heads hurried down carpeted hallways with thick stacks of audit files. Phone lines buzzed continuously as regional directors demanded answers from corporate communications. From my office window, I watched Julian Thorne arrive late, at 11 o'clock, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying his customary gourmet coffee, completely unaware that his corporate coup had just collapsed into a catastrophic legal minefield. As Julian walked past the executive suite, Vice President Vance Miller stepped out of his office, grabbed Julian firmly by the arm, and escorted him into a private conference room. Through the glass partition, I saw Julian gesturing wildly with his free hand, his confident smirk rapidly disappearing as Vance Miller tossed a heavy stack of legal compliance notices and federal hold orders onto the table. At 3:15 in the afternoon, I walked down to the executive lounge to refill my coffee cup. Chief Counsel Conrad was standing by the panoramic window, speaking quietly into his encrypted phone. When he saw me step into the room, he ended the call, adjusted his glasses, and walked over. "You actually executed Clause 8.2. Nolan," Conrad said, his voice a mixture of professional awe and deep disbelief. "Most executives keep those clauses as symbolic leverage during contract renewals. You turned it into a surgical strike against corporate overreach." I took a slow sip of coffee. "The clause exists to protect the architectural integrity of the platform and the legal standing of the company, counsel. When executive leadership chooses to bypass federal compliance and fraudulently distribute unauthorized material, the contract enforces itself." Conrad stared at me for a long moment, nodding slowly. "The board is scrambling behind closed doors." Julian thought he was accelerating market capture. He has no idea that he just triggered an enterprise-wide compliance freeze. I nodded politely, walked back to my office, and closed the door. Outside my window, the corporate sky darkened, and I sat in calm tranquility while Julian Thorne's world cracked wide open. By 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, the illusion of control at Apex Cloud Systems had completely shattered into dust. Julian Thorne had spent 3 frustrating hours attempting to call external partner executives, only to be met with automated legal hold recordings, gatekeeping assistance, and cold refusals from corporate counsel. Desperate to contain the mounting damage, Julian finally marched down the corridor toward my corner office. He did not knock. He pushed the heavy door open, stepped inside, and closed it behind him with exaggerated care. He held his coffee cup like a shield, attempting to project an air of casual camaraderie despite his sweating brow. "Hey, Nolan," Julian began, his voice strained and unnaturally high. "Do you have a quick minute to chat? I feel like there has been a tiny miscommunication about the launch deck. Look, I get it. You felt left out of the boardroom presentation on Tuesday. But the deck is already live in the market. Industry blogs are writing positive reviews about it. And I made sure our marketing team gave you full title credit in the internal release memo." I remained seated behind my desk, resting my hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. I looked directly into his eyes, maintaining absolute unblinking silence. Julian shifted his weight uncomfortably, his artificial smile faltering under my steady, icy gaze. "Come on, Nolan. Everyone edits slides before a major product launch. It is a standard team effort in enterprise tech. The core technical concepts were still yours. We just repackaged them to make them punchier for venture investors and board members. You do not need to take this so personally." I leaned forward slightly, keeping my tone measured, cold, and entirely devoid of emotional charge. Did you verify the cryptographic timestamp on the release bill, Julian? Did you include the mandatory federal compliance disclosures under Section 106 of Title 17? Julian waved his hand dismissively, trying to brush the question aside. Legal did not flag anything when we pushed the deck out on Wednesday afternoon. I looked at him with quiet pity. Legal did not flag it on Wednesday because you deliberately concealed the distribution from compliance auditors. But legal flagged it yesterday morning, after I filed formal enforcement under Clause 8.2 of my executive contract. Julian froze in place. His hands began to tremble noticeably, causing coffee to spill slightly over the rim of his paper cup onto his polished shoes. You filed a formal contractual enforcement clause? Against your own chief product officer? I did not file against a person, Julian, I replied calmly. I enforced a contractual dead man switch designed to prevent corporate officers from committing fraud and breaching fiduciary duties. The moment you distributed an unauthorized technical deck without my cryptographic sign-off, you rendered every external contract void ab initio. The color drained completely from Julian's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no coherent words came out. He backed out of my office, stumbling slightly against the wooden doorframe, his arrogant swagger replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. At 3:24 that afternoon, the chief executive officer arrived on the 12th floor. Through my glass office walls, I watched him march straight into the human resources suite, his face flushed red with anger as he gestured aggressively at internal compliance reports and federal audit notices. At 3:30, my phone chimed with an urgent internal message from Human Resources VP Grant Miller. Nolan, we would like to schedule an immediate mediation session with you and Julian to resolve this internal misunderstanding. We value your contributions and want to establish a constructive path forward. I did not reply to the message. I marked it as read, archived it in my compliance folder, and returned to reviewing my technical logs. At 4 o'clock, Compliance Officer Clara Miller walked past my office, carrying a sturdy cardboard box filled with her personal desk items and legal references. She had submitted her formal resignation to the board, refusing to cover up Julian's compliance violations or participate in corporate whitewashing. As she reached the elevator bank, she looked back at me through the glass, gave a firm, respectful nod, and stepped inside. At 4:45, I went to the executive break room to prepare a fresh cup of herbal tea. Julian Thorne was standing near the marble counter, trying to laugh loudly with two junior product managers, pretending that the mounting crisis was merely a temporary administrative hiccup that would blow over by next week. "Well, team," Julian announced loudly, casting a nervous glance in my direction. "It looks like Apex Cloud Systems will soon be in the market for a new lead technical strategist who understands agile corporate execution and team alignment." The junior managers looked down at the tile floor in embarrassed silence, refusing to join in his forced, desperate laughter. I took a slow, deliberate sip of tea, looked Julian dead in the eye, and spoke 4 words in a clear, resonant voice. "You should update your resume." Julian's jaw dropped. The break room went dead silent, as if the room had lost atmospheric pressure. I turned around calmly and walked back to my office, leaving him standing alone in the icy silence he had created. By Friday morning, the corporate fallout at Apex Cloud Systems had reached catastrophic, unmanageable proportions. At 8:15 in the morning, the main corporate website underwent an emergency update. The flashy press release announcing the $240 million enterprise cloud launch, the one featuring Julian Thorne's arrogant quotes about leading digital transformation, vanished entirely from public view. Visiting the original link returned a stark, generic error, 404 file not found notice. Colin Vance walked into my office at 9 o'clock, holding his tablet with wide, incredulous eyes. "Nolan, federal procurement portals have pulled down all co-branded marketing graphics. The Defense Logistics Agency just posted an administrative notice stating that all contract negotiations with Apex Cloud Systems are suspended indefinitely pending internal compliance remediation and audit review." I nodded calmly, placing my teacup onto its saucer. "That is the mandatory legal consequence of Clause 8.2, Colin. When an unauthorized deck is declared void ab initio, Federal agencies are legally prohibited from maintaining active procurement discussions or issuing contract disbursements to the vendor. Between 9:30 and 11 o'clock, the chief executive officer attempted to call my office desk line 6 separate times. Each time I allowed the phone to ring until it went silent. He sent 3 urgent emails requesting off-the-record discussions to smooth things over before the board meeting. I left every message unanswered. My silence was not born out of spite or anger. It was strategic legal discipline. Everything that needed to be communicated had already been articulated in immutable metadata and notarized contractual addendums. At 11:15, an internal executive memo leaked across the senior leadership network. A confidential risk assessment prepared by Counsel Conrad confirmed that my employment agreement contained absolute indemnification and legal immunity protection under Clause 8.2. Apex Cloud Systems could not terminate me, could not penalize my executive equity, and could not hold me financially liable for any losses resulting from the compliance freeze. The company was completely trapped by its own officers' illegal actions and shortcuts. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the board of directors convened an emergency video conference with executive leadership. Although I declined the invitation to attend, Colin Vance later provided a detailed transcript of the proceedings. Counsel Conrad opened the board meeting by displaying the metadata audit report on the shared screen. My name appeared in bold lettering at the top of the file, followed by precise, side-by-side technical comparisons, proving that Julian Thorne had intentionally stripped out federal compliance disclosures, intellectual property protections, and required security encryption keys. Julian attempted one final, desperate defense before the board members. Members of the board, Julian argued, his voice cracking with intense anxiety. This was simply accelerated innovation alignment. Nolan was copied on the working draft repository folders weeks ago. He had every opportunity to provide technical feedback. We cannot let a rigid internal administrative clause destroy a $240 million market opportunity. Counsel Conrad interrupted him with cold, surgical precision. Mr. Thorne, being copied on a working directory does not constitute cryptographic signatory sign-off under federal contract law. Clause 8.2 explicitly mandates written, time-stamped, authorized clearance from the lead architect prior to external distribution. By bypassing Mr. Vance, you committed a direct breach of internal compliance, violated federal intellectual property regulations under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 106, and exposed this corporation to catastrophic legal liability and federal debarment. The board members sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. One senior director finally asked, "Is there any legal path to salvage the enterprise contracts under the current deck build?" "None whatsoever," Conrad replied flatly. "The enterprise partners have already initiated formal withdrawal under breach of warranty provisions. The distributed release is null and void ab initio." At 3:45 that afternoon, Human Resources published an emergency internal job posting on the corporate intranet. Opening for Executive Vice President of Product Management, immediate backfill required. Julian Thorne's name had been completely scrubbed from the executive directory and organizational charts. When I packed my leather briefcase at 5 o'clock and walked toward the executive elevators, I passed Julian's former corner office. Human Resources personnel were packing his personal belongings into plain cardboard boxes. Julian sat silently in a chair in the corner, staring blankly at the carpet. A broken man who had learned too late that corporate titles and polished presentations cannot override legal compliance and structural engineering integrity. As I rode the elevator down to the parking garage, I reflected on the 18 months of effort I had poured into Apex Cloud Systems. I had built a solution that was structurally robust, legally compliant, and technically sound. The tragedy was not that Julian Thorne had attempted to usurp the launch. The tragedy was that corporate leadership had allowed short-term greed to overshadow foundational governance. In their haste to claim a victory they had not earned, they had triggered their own institutional downfall. My departure was not an act of vengeance. It was the natural outcome of a system rejecting structural corruption. I drove home in quiet contentment, knowing that my professional reputation remained flawless and untarnished. On Monday morning, 2 weeks after the compliance collapse at Apex Cloud Systems, I stepped out of a black sedan in front of the glass headquarters of Solon Infrastructure Solutions. Solon was a premier, highly respected enterprise cloud engineering firm located in the heart of the financial district, known throughout the industry for rigorous compliance standards and flawless federal execution. There were no flashy press releases, no social media announcements with confetti graphics, and no corporate fanfare. I walked quietly into their executive lobby carrying my leather briefcase, radiating a calm, quiet confidence. Solon Infrastructure had created a new executive role specifically tailored to my expertise. Chief Strategy Officer of Federal Infrastructure, complete with total architectural autonomy, direct authority over technical compliance sign-offs, and an unyielding commitment to engineering integrity. I signed the employment contract using the exact same fountain pen I had used to sign Clause 8.2 2 years earlier at Apex Cloud Systems. It felt like absolute professional symmetry. The market response to my transition was swift, decisive, and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of my arrival at Solon Infrastructure Solutions, 3 major federal defense agencies and 2 enterprise healthcare partners formally severed their contract discussions with Apex Cloud Systems, citing a total loss of confidence in Apex executive leadership and vendor governance. Those same high-value enterprise clients immediately opened contract negotiations with Solon Infrastructure Solutions. They transferred their $240 million cloud migration accounts to my team, knowing that under my leadership, every architectural deployment would be legally sound, federally compliant, and executed with absolute precision. Apex Cloud Systems was forced to issue a quiet quarterly restructuring report to shareholders, declaring massive financial write-downs and announcing the complete cancellation of their flagship enterprise cloud initiative. The board of directors initiated a total executive overhaul, terminating 2 senior vice presidents who had supported Julian Thorne's unauthorized launch attempt. Julian Thorne was quietly placed on indefinite administrative leave before being formally terminated for cause without severance or stock vesting options. Industry executive recruiters blacklisted his name due to the severe federal compliance audit findings attached to his permanent record. On my 3rd Friday evening at Solon Infrastructure Solutions, as I sat in my new corner office overlooking the illuminated city skyline, my personal mobile phone chimed with a text message from a former vice president at Apex Cloud Systems. The text message read, "Nolan, why didn't you give us a heads up before invoking Clause 8.2? You destroyed Julian's career and crippled the entire product line in less than 48 hours. I picked up my phone, looked out at the quiet city lights below, and typed a calm, deliberate response without punctuation, hesitation, or regret. Next time ask who built the floor before you start dancing on the table." I hit send, set the phone face down on my mahogany desk, and took a slow, satisfying sip of dark roast coffee. I had not burned Apex Cloud Systems to the ground with anger or malice. I had simply stepped away and allowed the weight of their own arrogance, shortcuts, and illegal actions to collapse the fragile structure beneath them. True authority in corporate America does not come from loud speeches, stolen slides, or inflated corporate titles. It comes from silent legal clarity, unyielding architectural standards, and the absolute power of knowing when to execute the kill clause. Looking out over the harbor, I realized that true professional satisfaction comes from building systems that endure. The complex cloud architecture I had engineered was now housed where it belonged, at an institution that respected federal compliance, honored intellectual property rights, and recognized that genuine leadership requires absolute integrity. As I watched the cargo ships navigate the dark waters of the bay, Colin Vance knocked gently on my open office door. He held a leather binder containing our new federal compliance framework for Solon Infrastructure Solutions. He had decided to follow me to Solon, recognizing that working alongside an architect who valued integrity was far more rewarding than enduring the toxic instability of corporate opportunists. "Everything is locked and verified for next month's federal audit, Nolan," Colin said with a warm, genuine smile. Every line of code, every encryption key, and every partner disclosure has been verified against our legal repository. We have established complete traceability across all 5 module layers, ensuring that no unauthorized modifications can ever bypass audit protocols again. I smiled back, gesturing toward the conference table. Thank you, Colin. That is how real enterprise architecture is built. Not through shortcuts or stolen decks, but through meticulous discipline and unwavering legal integrity. We have built an organization where compliance is not an afterthought, but the very foundation of innovation. When technical professionals stand firm behind their work and enforce legal protections, corporate shortcuts become impossible. He placed the binder on my desk and walked out, leaving me to enjoy the peaceful evening quiet. As the city lights reflected off the glass towers around me, I closed my laptop and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The floor I had built was solid, the foundation was unbreakable, and the future was entirely mine to define.